I'm Helena Cobban, and I'm pleased that so many of you have come today. It's a little bit bright here, but that's okay, I can handle it. So I am the president of a nonprofit called Just World Educational, and we work to educate the public about issues of burning concern to do with war, peace, international justice, etc. So this book, here's where I hold up the book. Okay, you can tell I'm not quite really organized
Good day
here.
to everybody.
Oh.
I'm sorry I can't be with you in person.
Okay, so it's going to be fun, obviously. So, so this book, Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters, is part of a broader project of the same name that Just World Educational launched last spring, because we figured that a lot of people were sort of picking up the humanitarian crisis aspect of this, but of what's been happening in Gaza and now, of course, also Lebanon and elsewhere. But nobody really wanted to pick up what we refer to like the H word, the dreaded H word. So we thought, we really need to explain why people need to understand Hamas. So that's the origin of the project. And it started off with a series of 5 webinars that we presented in May with 5 experts on the movement. And then we transcribed the webinars. People loved the transcripts. They said, make a book. So I made a book. I know how to make books. And so my co-pilot on the whole project was Rami, Khouri, who is a very well-known Palestinian Christian commentator. His family is originally from Nazareth, and we're delighted that he's a member of our board on Just World Educational. So he couldn't come here today. So here is his message. Maybe. No, it's okay.
Hello and good day to everybody. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person as I'd like to be, but Helena is going to keep you pretty well informed. And I want to just add a few points about why I think this book is important and why we did it, and what are the 1 or 2 key points about Hamas that you want to keep in mind as this whole process of the transformation of the Middle East and relations between the Arab countries and Palestinians and Iran and Israel and the US, all this stuff keeps changing, and the war drums keep getting louder and louder. They're not just drums, they're actual war manifestations. The reason that this book is worth reading is because it is the work of 5 really serious scholars who have lived with Palestinians in Gaza for years, interviewed all the key players, know them personally, and it's a very rare source of empirical evidence based on a real on-the-ground research and personal contacts that gives you insights into Hamas that you would not get anywhere else. But Hamas itself is not the most important thing. The most important thing is how Hamas reflects the wider Palestinian national sentiment, and how Hamas has been, over the years, the permanent repository of both the values and sentiments and aspirations of Palestinians, but also their pragmatism in trying to address how do we get out of the war and the occupation and all the stuff that's going on into a situation of serious negotiations aiming for a permanent resolution that is based on equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians and other involved parties like the Syrians and Lebanese. How do we make that historic transition? Hamas is misunderstood, and I don't support many of the things that Hamas does, whether it's some of their social policies or some of their militancy, including some of the terrorism that they've done over the years. But to be fair, every actor in this process, the Israelis, the Americans, the other Arabs, the Syrians, the Lebanese, they've all done a little bit of everything. None of us are guilt-free. But the important thing about Hamas is that they have maintained a position on the political requirements for a just and permanent resolution. They've maintained that position for decades and decades. They're the only Palestinian group that has articulated that position, which reflects the wider Palestinian consensus, and at the same time taken action to make the resistance in their name, Al-Haraka al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic resistance movement. They've made resistance a verb, not just an abstract noun. They resist, and they resist in various ways, and one of them is by using arms. And the outcome is very complex and often, as we've seen recently in Gaza, really painful for Palestinians. But they are important for that reason, that they do reflect the national consensus. The other point I want to make about Hamas is how their decision-making works, that this is not, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, where one person has all the power, makes all the decisions, and getting rid of that person changes the entire situation. Hamas is a group that has evolved over the last 4 decades in terms of its organizational structure, its decision-making, its consultation system, its internal elections. It's a very sophisticated mechanism. Hezbollah is very similar in Lebanon to Hamas, but they both put a lot of emphasis on reaching decisions through a very consultative process among their different component elements, including the prisoners in Israeli jails. And once they reach a consensus, they have a policy that represents all of Hamas and tends to represent all of Palestinians. That's why they're important to talk to. And a related point to that is that the positions that Hamas has taken over the years have almost always reflected a pragmatic willingness to negotiate an end to the conflict with Israel. Of course, the terms that the Hamas expects, as all Palestinians do, would include implementing UN resolutions and international law, ending the occupation, removing the settlements or exchanging settlements for other land. In other words, equal justice for both sides simultaneously, not the old Oslo process approach of the Palestinians get a little bit here, and then if they behave, they might get a little bit more. It's got to be equal justice simultaneously respected by all. And they have at least 10 times in the last 30, 40 years sent messages, sent letters, spoken in public about coexisting with the state of Israel under conditions that give the Palestinians the same national rights, sovereignty, security, and opportunity that the Israelis already have as a recognized state. So they're not people who just go and make war and want to kill Israelis. They are people who do resistance for the purpose of triggering a political resolution ultimately. And this is a complex set of emotions and activities that most people in the Western world who rely for their news about Hamas on the mainstream media have no idea about. This is an alien world for most people in the West, except for a few scholars and experts here and there. But this is why this book is important, because it really shows you what Hamas feels, who they represent, how they reach their positions, and what they're aspiring for. And even with all of the violence and tragedy of the last year or more, they still maintain that position. And when Sinwar was assassinated, when he was killed in the battlefield, it is unlike what you hear from the White House or mainstream media in the West. This is not a game changer that's going to suddenly open up opportunities for peacemaking, because Sinwar was elected through a very consultative process, and before him other Hamas leaders were assassinated. He's the 4th one to be assassinated now or killed, and the process goes on. And in fact, what happens is, we've seen it in Hezbollah and Hamas, when you assassinate the leader, the organization is anticipating that and is prepared to quickly keep moving with its strategy that is one that represents the sentiments of the majority of all their members. So Sinwar's death is not a big game changer. We will have new leaders appointed. Hamas has been hurt badly by the war, by the genocide, and the process of how Hamas reorganizes and reemerges in a political form or military form, we don't know. This is to be seen in the future. So it's important to understand the principles that Hamas stands for and to understand that they are a reflection of overall Palestinian sentiment, and I would say of overall global sentiment. People all over the world who support Palestinian rights would have no problem with the position that Hamas has laid out. The problem is that people in the West especially, in the media especially, and political people have never taken the 5 minutes they need to look through some of these statements and talk to some of these people who are involved. And I think we're going to probably reach a point soon where, just as the United States fought with the Viet Cong and then negotiated with them, fought with the Taliban and then negotiated with them, created wars in Iraq and got involved in wars in Somalia and Libya, and creating huge messes in all of these places. The US will change its policy. The Western world will ultimately have to sit down and talk to people, if not Hamas, other groups that emerge that represent the same views that Hamas represents. So those are the quick points I wanted to make, and Helena will fill you in on the details and explain more of these and add other points that you should know. But we're really grateful that you're attending this event, and we promise to keep providing you with any insights that we can in the years to come.
Yeah, just a quick introduction. All right, so I'm coming in at an odd moment, but thank you to Rami Khouri for his reporting. My name is Fida Adeli, and I'm the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Clovis and Hala Salam Maksud Chair in Arab Studies at Georgetown University. So I want to welcome you to this book discussion of this book, Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters, by Helena Cobban and Rami Khouri. And so we just heard from Rami, we're going to be hearing more from Helena now. And I would like to do a little bit of an introduction for Helena, abbreviated one. There's a longer one on our website if you're interested. Helena Cobban is a writer and researcher on international affairs who lives in Washington, D.C. In 1984, Cambridge University Press published her seminal study, The Palestinian Liberation Organization. Three of her 6 other sole-authored books also dealt with the political and strategical developments in the Arab-Israeli theater, and the rest with more global matters. She also regularly contributes to news columns, and she is the founder of Just World Books and the co-founder of Just World Educational, where she serves as president. And the main platform currently is globalities.org. Thank you. So Helena will begin with the presentation, picking up from where Rami left off, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. Simply just raise your hand, and we'll try to get as many questions as possible. We also, for our online audience, there are instructions in the Zoom chat for where you can post your questions. And the book is available for purchase just outside, and there's also a link in the Zoom chat for those joining remotely. So once again, thank you for joining us, Helena. It's a pleasure to have you back. When were you said you were here last talking about your first book about the PLO?
No, actually, well, I can give a little.
Yeah,
Anyway,
sure.
it's great to be back. Actually, in 1982, when I came to the United States to write my first book, which was, as people said, The Palestinian Liberation Organization, People, Power, and Politics, published in 1984 by Cambridge University Press. So I kind of like to think that this is sort of a biblical 40-year cycle that I'm part of. But 82 was a horrible year to be here, honestly. The Israelis were bombing the hell out of Beirut. So I feel in many respects that I've been here before, trying to just uphold the idea that Palestinian resistance is not irrational, it's not fueled by hate, it's the natural resistance that any occupied people or any colonized people would undertake, and it takes many, many different forms, including kind of civil organizing, education of women, preschool education, all kinds of different social activities, kind of community-based lending organizations and so on, as well as military resistance. So anybody who has lived under military occupation or settler colonialism understands this multifaceted nature of resistance and the need for it. So I was writing my book when I was here. So there was Mike Hudson was the head of Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and Hisham Sharabi was here, Hannah Batatu was here, Halim Barakat was here. It was really a wonderful time to be here with these great scholars and leaders. And actually, the last time I was on the Georgetown campus, just over a year ago, it was the memorial for Dr. Halim Barakat, which was held here on October 7th, 2023. And he was the last of those 4 people to die. So, you know, you guys are the heirs to an amazing body of people and thought and free discussion and so on and so forth. I did come back here to a conference, I think in 2009 or 2010, when I'd recently returned from a research trip I'd made to Gaza, where I interviewed several Hamas leaders. The fact is that I have interviewed Hamas people at various levels of the organization, from the grassroots to the top leadership, between 1989 and 2011, 2012, when my life got kind of overtaken by book publishing, which I'm glad that I did, because I've published some really distinctive and important books by Palestinian authors, as well as Zionism questioning Jewish authors like Miko Peled or Alice Rothschild. So I conducted these interviews for my research and for my writing in various places, including Gaza, the West Bank, Damascus, Beirut, and probably others that I can't remember. So in March of this year, as I mentioned earlier, the Just World Educational Board decided to launch this new project. And I want to underscore the importance of the whole of the title, because it's understanding Hamas and why that matters. It's not why it matters. It's not why Hamas matters. It's why the understanding matters. But, you know, I'm sure you're all smart enough to figure that out. So why is it important to understand Hamas? I thought about this a lot, and I've got 6 reasons, basically. The first is to counter, just at a very basic level, to counter the myths, smears, and the downright disinformation that has been put out about Hamas, especially in Western public discourse, by political leaders as well as the mainstream media, as Rami mentioned, including the ones about October 7th, 2023, the 40 beheaded babies, you know, that President Biden keeps referring to. Or are they burned? Sometimes they're burned, sometimes they're beheaded. You know, it's kind of very similar to the infants that were thrown out of the incubators, allegedly, when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait in 1990. And then, of course, the whole thing about an organized campaign of mass rape. A lot of these allegations, I honestly tend to think of them more as statements of Israeli intent. You know, we're claiming that those guys engaged in a campaign of mass rape against us. Well, you wait till you see what we do in our prisons. You know, we say that there were 40 beheaded babies or whatever. You wait till you see what we can do to thousands of your babies in Gaza. So it's very important that those facts be examined in detail, which has happened both in the Israeli media and by really smart investigative journalists in this country, like Max Blumenthal and Ali Abu Nimr and Asa Winstanley, and really trying to get at the heart of what did happen on October 7th, 2023. So second reason it's important to understand Hamas, these are in no particular order, but second reason I'd put here is this idea that Hamas is socially regressive, intolerant, and as the saying goes, it's just like ISIS. I mean, anybody who has studied the two organizations understands that there are numerous differences between Hamas and ISIS, including, the whole woman question. Back in, I want to say 2006, when I was doing some research in Gaza, right after the election, that Hamas won the legislative election, they won the election, and 4 of the elected Hamas parliamentarians were women. And I got to interview 2 of them, Dr. Jamila Shanti, who is just a wonderful working woman, very capable, and I think they later made her a minister. And another one, I forget her name. By the way, Dr. Jamila Shanti was assassinated by the Israelis, I want to say, in November of last year, or maybe February of this year. She was the widow of Abdelaziz Rantisi, who was assassinated by the Israelis back in 2003. So there are many ways, and we actually go through them in the book in some detail in chapter 2 of the book, in which Hamas is not like ISIS. And part of that has to do with religious/sectarian tolerance. I mean, if you were like a Christian like Rami Khouri in northern Syria, where ISIS and Al-Qaeda are taking over, like, that's it. You're not allowed to be heterodox in any way. But Rami, like me, basically a journalist, has been around for a long time, interviewed a lot of these people. And although I don't think in an election, I never asked him, I don't think he would vote for them, but he definitely, as we saw, recognizes that they represent something broad and inclusive in Palestinian resistance. So third here, the idea, this is an idea, a terrible idea, that if you disable Hamas militarily, you end Hamas as a continuing movement. I mean, that is put out a lot. So in our book, we look a lot at like the relationship between the military wing, the Aizadin al-Qassam brigades, and the political leadership under the Shura Council, and how sometimes the political leadership has said, yes, we need to go ahead and authorize such and such a type of military action, including on occasions actions against civilians, because the Israelis would not hold back in their attacks against Palestinian civilians, which was an offer that the Hamas Shura Council repeatedly made. We won't attack your civilians if you don't attack our civilians. But then on occasion, the Shura Council would say, okay, hold off on all the military activities. They did that in 1996 in preparation, in order to allow the situation for the first round of Palestinian elections, Palestinian legislative elections under Oslo, even though they didn't participate in the elections. The Shura Council decided not to participate, but to allow the elections to continue. Then in 2006, again, they held back on the military actions in order to allow the 2006 legislative elections, in which they participated and in which, as I hope you all are aware, they won the election. Actually, I think I just mentioned that, so I hope you know that. And then they got clobbered in response, because Condoleezza Rice and was it Ehud Olmert at the time, whichever of these Israeli leaders it was, I think it was Olmert, couldn't believe that Hamas would win an election. So they decided, oh, well, we have to overthrow this election, overturn the results, which has been amply documented by the investigative journalist David Rose in a book, in an article that we put into our bibliography here. So then there is the idea, this is the fourth misconception about Hamas, if you like, that Hamas exists only in Gaza. So if you can just like genocide all the people of Gaza, then you've solved your Hamas problem. It's not true. I mean, first of all, obviously, it's quite immoral and illegitimate for them to genocide all the people in Gaza on the allegation that you voted for Hamas or whatever, or you supported Hamas. I mean, that is just outrageous, like beyond belief. But also, Hamas does not exist only in Gaza. As we, found out from our guest experts, including Dr. Paola Caridi, who's a wonderful Italian expert who's lived in Jerusalem and Gaza for many years in the early aughts. The Shura Council basically is elected from and responsible to 4 different constituencies. Constituency in Gaza, constituency in the West Bank, constituency in the Palestinian diaspora, and the crucial 4th constituency is the prisoners, the Hamas, the numerous hundreds of Hamas people who are in Israeli prisons. So that is how basically the Shura Council gets elected or chosen from those 4 constituencies. So the idea that even if you totally wipe out Hamas in Gaza, that's the end of Hamas, it's quite fallacious. In fact, the more there is repression in Gaza, the more support there is for Hamas, not just in the West Bank, but also in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and that's the close-in diaspora. That's where there are large refugee camps, but also in the further Palestinian diaspora. So then the 5th one is the idea that if you get a ceasefire in Gaza, somehow that is giving something to Hamas. That is frequently argued on the mainstream media. Needs underscoring that our government is on an intermittent and sometimes fairly intensive basis actually negotiating with Hamas, indirectly through the Qataris and the Egyptians. But as soon as there has been like any negotiation for a ceasefire since 2006, 2007, that negotiation is held with Hamas. And there have been many ceasefires. And the most recent, of course, was the one last November, when for 7 days there was a ceasefire that was respected by both sides, and that resulted in the release of, I want to say, 130 of the Israeli hostages and several hundred of the Palestinian prisoners. I mean, that was the deal, and that is still the deal that Blinken is allegedly trying to, I don't think he is, honestly. So let's not talk about him. Anyway, this idea that if you get a ceasefire, you're giving something to Hamas is ridiculous. Both sides profit and benefit from a ceasefire. Then the idea that it is Hamas that has been blocking the ceasefire this year, which is what we hear quite a lot, except, that there was a ceasefire proposal that I suppose Blinken and the people in the White House managed to cobble together like a 3-phase ceasefire thing back in May, and then they got the UN Security Council to adopt it on June 10th with a little bit of fuzziness. And then the Israelis came out right away and said they don't support it at all. Netanyahu always says or indicates one thing to the Americans, and then he goes back to his cabinet and says, no, I never agreed to that. And that's been the case since June, although Hamas has underlined since then a number of times, including on July 10th, their agreement to the terms of that basically UN Security Council 3-phase ceasefire. So I think one of the really important reasons that we need to understand Hamas, obviously by the book and all of that fine stuff, is because our country has been suffering not just from diplomasophobia, I just invented this word yesterday, but also from diplomasoclasm, which is like iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is when you take visual representations of things, icons, and then you smash them. I mean, our country has actually been involved in smashing the whole concept of international diplomacy. So what I see our book as being, it's a radical plea for effective diplomacy and for a return by our government to the tools and mechanisms of diplomacy, where for far too long now, it has relied only on battering rams and military force and, let's send more 2,000-pound bombs to Israel and that might get the job done. So that's why I think it's really important to understand Hamas. And so what did we learn in our explorations? The book, the heart of the book is the 5 chapters that are essentially the transcripts from our 5 webinar sessions. So I mentioned Dr. Paola Caridi. Let me run through the others quickly. Paola obviously has written a book about Hamas, and in a new edition came out, I think, last October, in a timely way for her, I think, and her. So the second specialist was Dr. Khalid Haroub, who is a Palestinian academic with Northwestern University, who's written maybe 2 books about Hamas, and I think the third one may be about to come out. Then we had Dr. Jeroen Gunning, whom I hadn't actually encountered before we did this, and then somebody suggested I approach him. Jeroen is a Dutch-British academic, and he spent, just as Paola spent a bunch of time as a writer and researcher in Jerusalem and Gaza I want to say from 2003 to 2012. Jeroen did his doctoral dissertation, his doctoral research in Gaza in the 1990s. So he has just a wealth of on-the-ground information that's in his book about Hamas, which is quite an old book, but it's extremely valuable. But then in the early aughts, he went on to become one of the co-founders of a whole new academic discipline based primarily in Europe, but also in this country, which is the discipline or field or whatever you call it, of critical terrorism studies. So, this town of all towns is just larded with, very well-funded think tanks and programs and centers and conferences and God knows what that are all about terrorism studies, designed to make you feel very, very afraid and to boost the profits of the military-industrial complex. So Jeroen and his colleagues have founded and for the last, I want to say 20 years maybe, maintained a really good journal called the Journal of Critical Terrorism Studies that really seeks to take apart many of the assumptions of mainstream terrorism studies. So what he brought to this in particular was like a very robust idea of the role that counterterrorism or the launching of allegations of terrorism has always played in late colonial entities to try to counter the national liberation movements. And, I was growing up in England in the 1950s, and it was the Mau Mau, be very afraid, and obviously when in the 70s and 80s in this country, it was the Viet Cong, be very afraid. So there's and if you were in France, you had to be afraid of the Algerians, definitely. So, I think Jeroen really brings a lot of different things to his chapter here. And then we had Moain Rabbani, who is somebody I've known forever. I think Moain is actually a graduate of the master's program here. And he does a lot of different things. What he brought to the discussion really was his very nuanced ability to analyze relations between Hamas and the other Palestinian movements and the role that Hamas plays in the broader regional axis of resistance. And then the last session that we had was a conversation that 5 of our board members, not just Rami and me, but we brought in 3 other board members, including Nora Barrows-Friedman from Electronic Intifada, Rick Sterling from the West Coast, and Dr. Zahara Simmons from Florida. And the 5 of us had a really good conversation with a guy called Dr. Azam Tamimi, who is one of the founders of sort of the field of Islam and democracy and the relationships between Islam and a sort of an almost originalist version of Sunni Islam and democracy in action, like decision-making by shuras and whatever, shura councils. Azam was one of the founders of the Institute for Islamic Political Thought, which used to operate here, I think, in Northern Virginia, and then it got shut down by the FBI. So now he's in London, and we had a really good conversation with him. He is also, he's published 2 or 3 books about Hamas. One of them was titled, in its UK version, Hamas, A Story from Within. In this country, it had a different title, but he's definitely close to the people who founded Hamas back in 1987. So it was very valuable for us. We had I want to say, a free and frank discussion with him, including the question of what did Hamas think they were doing, what were they hoping to do, what were they hoping to achieve on October 7th, 2023. And so his explanation of that, I think, is very valuable. We also have a bunch of appendices in the book, and one of the appendices is the report, or the statement, I want to say, a sort of an 8-page, 10-page statement that Hamas put out last January, which was their official version of what they were aiming at achieving on October 7th, 2023. The other, I think the appendices are also, the other appendices are also worth looking at, because they provide essential documentation, including something from like why the US has designated Hamas as a foreign terrorist organization, in case you're interested in that. And so our goal with the book was to make it extremely accessible to non-specialists, because, you know, it's wonderful if you have the time to really dive in deep and read all these books by Jeroen and Paula and Khalid and Azam and the many other fine scholars like Tariq Bahroni and Sarah Roy has written a book about Hamas. There are a lot of fine books in the English language about Hamas, but not everybody has the time to dig in like that. So this is like a primer, if you want. I called it a gateway drug the other day. Maybe that wasn't very appropriate. But, you know, if you want to find a way into looking at Hamas, so that's how we put in a bibliography, we put in a glossary of political terms, we put in a list of the main personalities who are referred to, because of course in our webinars, we were just like tossing names and references around. So what comes out of this? I think I've mentioned the main points already. The way that Hamas is based on these 4 constituencies, the relationship between the political and military. Khalid Haroub was particularly strong on that. He said it's not a binary. He was like very, very intent on saying it's not a binary between the political and the military. And Jeroen Gunning giving us the global colonial / anti-colonial framework. I'll just quickly run through the timeline. Maybe I should have done this earlier on. We put this at the beginning of the book, actually, because I think it's important for people to understand that there is a timeline for the history of Hamas. So Hamas was born in late 1987 at the time of the outbreak of the first Palestinian Intifada. So one of the things that's kind of interesting to me is that when this book came out in 1984, one of my chief conclusions here, it was all based on interviews that I had done with Fatah and PFLP and DFLP leaders in Beirut, Damascus, Kuwait, Algeria, Cairo. I mean, it was all with people in diaspora. And then 1982 happened and the PLO got booted out of Lebanon, and we had the Sabra and Shatila massacre. And one of the conclusions that I put into this book is that actually after that big setback for the diaspora Palestinian movement, the center of gravity of the movement would move into the Palestinians located still in the homeland. And so then in 1987, the first Intifada broke out. And did I call it or what? I called it. So that was the first Intifada, and Hamas was born, issued its first charter in August of 1988, which was a fairly anti-Semitic charter and frequently gets cited by Hamas haters. Then in September 1993, the PLO signed the Oslo Accords. Probably most of the people here know that, but in February 1994, this is really important to remember and understand, the US-born Israeli settler Baruch Goldstein went on his armed rampage in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, massacring 29 worshippers. And that was a turning point, not just for the Hamas people, but for many, many Palestinians, because like you go to a mosque to worship and somebody comes and mows you down. So then they launched attacks against civilians in Israel. And then, as I said, they held back on that in 1996 to allow those elections to happen. Fast forward to 2005, when Sharon pulled the Israeli settlers and soldiers out of the interior of the Gaza Strip, but he did not end Israel's occupation of Gaza. So then in 2006, Hamas won the parliamentary elections. Fast forward to May 2017, Hamas leaders adopted a new revised charter. So this is something that, you know, people who spout off about their original charter never mention the revised charter of 2017, where the language is noticeably different and is at pains to differentiate between Judaism as a religion and Zionism as a settler colonial movement, and indicates an openness to having, you know, what is called in Arabic either hudna or a tahdiyya, a sort of an interim truce / ceasefire / armistice, basically along the 1967 lines. And I think we asked Azam Tamimi about this in our session with him. And he said Hamas still wants to see, you know, a single state in the whole of historic Palestine. He doesn't want it to be secular, which is what the PLO wants. He wants a single democratic state, whereas the PLO line is for a secular democratic state. But he said if the Palestinian people as a whole agree to a two-state situation as on the road to the single state, then Hamas would accept that and would join the government. So, you know, they're definitely putting out the idea that they can play with the or they can play in the diplomacy of implementing Resolution 242. And I think that's very important right now. In particular, if you're thinking of how to get a solution in Gaza, which in my view needs not just a ceasefire, but the end to the occupation, to Israel's occupation of Gaza, because every time previously that there's been a ceasefire, the Israelis have stayed in their situation of controlling all the borders, land, sea, and air, and the population registry of Gaza. Gaza has continued to act since 1967, not just as a captive society of Israel, but as a captive economy. So, every time previously when there's been like, oh, let's reconstruct Gaza. And so the Americans and the Japanese and the Europeans give hundreds and thousands of dollars to reconstruct Gaza, but it all has to go in through Israel, and it's all controlled by Israel. And the Israeli contracting companies and tax authorities all take their margin, a very hefty margin of that. So you can actually say that all those previous reconstruction efforts have been a profit center for the Israeli economy because of the captive nature of Gaza's economy. So this time it has to be different. This time the United Nations has to say it's time to end the occupation of Gaza, and by the way, end the occupation of the West Bank and Golan at the same time. Achieving all of that will take a bit of time, but I think ending the occupation of Gaza is something the United Nations could do much faster. And if that's going to happen, then Hamas will be a part of that process. They don't want to run it. They have run Gaza for 17 years, and that's not what they're about. They're not about, they're pretty good at running administrations. They've administered all kinds of things, including Gaza municipality, the water and sewer system, under terrible circumstances. But they would rather be a liberation movement. And their position is that if there's a unified Palestinian liberation movement, that is, that they would be allowed back into the PLO, which has worldwide recognition as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, then they would love to have, for example, Marwan Barghouti from Fatah as the president, as the head. And that's a very popular position amongst Palestinians generally, and it's one that Hamas thoroughly endorses. So they don't want to run this thing, but they want to be a part of it, and obviously they don't want to be excluded or exterminated, which is what the current US-Israeli policy is. So I've given a kind of a broad overview, Fida, if you want to take questions or whatever, if you have questions.
Yeah, I think we should open it up. I'm sure people have lots of questions. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Should we identify ourselves or?
Sure, yeah.
So Bill Lawrence, I teach at American University and work at the U.S. Council, the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations, and I'm a frequent media commentator on Gaza. So agree with everything you said. I have three sort of clarifying questions. One is, I'm sympathetic to the idea that Hamas is an idea and can't be defeated. I just don't like the concept. You know what I mean? Hamas isn't an idea. You gave the better concept. It's a movement. It's a resistance. It's not just an idea. So I'm just wondering, this whole set of arguments, a number of my colleagues in Washington keep making that Hamas is an idea. I just wondered if you have a better way to conceive of Hamas as not an idea. Second question. A lot of the people who make the counter argument to yours on the Hamas charter say wrongly, we'll agree that it's wrong, but I want the response, right? That the 2017 statement was not an amendment to the charter or a revision of the charter or replacement to the charter. It was just a statement of the position in 2017 and doesn't carry any weight over the charter. So I wondered if you have the answer to that question. And then my third, these are pretty straightforward, so I don't think. The third one is, I recently watched the meeting ran by Daniela Weiss, who's the leader of a consortium of settler organizations who lined up a few thousand people to resettle Gaza. And what struck me watching the meeting was that the whole meeting was in English. And I asked a couple friends of mine who tracked settler issues, like, what's going on there? Is it a bunch of Americans? I mean, I know a bunch of people from New York and Boston, where I'm from, who are involved in the settler activities. But she said, no, it's sort of the lingua franca of all the settlers. There are settlers from France and Belgium and the UK and Australia and other places who the common language is not Hebrew, it's English. So all the signs are in Hebrew, but the whole debate was in English. And I was just wondered if you could answer, like, what this whole settler movement's about, not just linguistically, but what that tells us, right, about who these settlers are and how they organize and all that. So those are my three questions.
Well, great question. Thanks. Hamas as an idea, I think it is an idea, it is an idea as well as a movement. And if it were only an idea and not a movement, then that wouldn't count for very much.
Right, yeah. We need a better idea.
I'm not opposed to thinking of it as an idea, but just their grassroots organizing has been so meticulous over the 37 years the movement has been in existence. Just organizing, like, women's circles, getting space for women to worship in the mosques, big thing. Supporting all kinds of social programs, supporting educational programs. But all these things are firstly based on a deep commitment to their understanding of Islam, and secondly, based on the fact that it's part of a national liberation movement. And that actually makes it is one of the many differences between Hamas and ISIS. ISIS is not attached to any terrain. They don't have a national constituency. Just in relation to that is Hamas's diplomacy, which they pursue, with governments around the world on the basis of existing international law. So, they're doing so many different things that, in addition to their military activities, and it is a movement.
Yeah.
Not an idea, but it's also an idea.
Yeah, right.
So,
I get the point. I
Yeah,
just wanted to get
okay.
a better idea of what to call them.
So the status of the 2017 document, it is a little questioned by those very people, the Hamas haters. And I think Azam Tamimi gave us a really good explanation of it that you'll find in chapter 5 of the book. One thing he said was that in August of 1988, when the so-called Mithaq, the Hamas charter, was issued, it was not the result of any shura process, consultation. It was, as he kind of said, it was some random school teacher somewhere put it out because all the Hamas leaders were in jail at the time. And he said, he said that, I think this is what he said. I can't remember. I've been reading so many other things recently on this and other issues. Was that if you ask them to abandon the 1988 charter, that is a huge ask, because a lot of people, who are Hamas supporters still do support that. But the Shura Council, which is their kind of their leadership consultative body, adopted the 2017 document after extensive discussion. So it has, in his view, much more legitimacy than this kind of random school teacher. But obviously, in the context of a negotiation, a leadership level negotiation, whether, first of all, with the PLO leadership as a part of coming back into the PLO, or at the international level, with other parties, or Israel, or members of the BRICS, or Turkey, or whomsoever, maybe they would be prepared to dial down or renounce set aside the 1988 document, but they're not going to just do it because they've seen with the PLO, when Arafat, goes on TV and he says, I renounce tourism. And everybody was like, did he say tourism? Or, the PLO gave it all up in advance, and then Fatah, and then got nothing. I mean, that's the very widespread view among Palestinians, not just Hamas people. So a little bit of uncertainty about the status of the 2017 document, but I do urge you to go and read chapter 5, where Dr. Azam talked about this. And then the nature of the settler movement. Huge,
culture of the settler movement. Yes.
Huge story. I can't begin to encompass it here. I will just note that Dr. Ilan Pape recently, I think it was on last week's Electronic Intifada live stream on the Wednesday or sometime, I've heard him very convincingly say that what's happening in Israel right now is a civil war between the state of Israel, as people have known it until now, and the state of Judea, which is basically Netanyahu and all the forces to the right of him, and so he sees the state of Judea as being a rising and very terrifying force. Now, as to whether they communicate in English, I wouldn't be surprised if they communicate in English, given how many New York Jewish people, from Meir Kahane and Baruch Goldstein and all the greats of the settler movement were US born Jews. So maybe English is their lingua franca, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question about the PLO. So I do follow Pape's assumption about Judea and Samaria, because when Smotrich was put in charge of the finance portfolio, he basically stripped the PA of a lot of its resources and its ability to have legitimacy by paying. So being late on, let's say salaries to teachers and whatnot, causing a lot of strife. And so post all of this, October 7th, whenever the ceasefire does come, the PA is crippled entirely. And now seeing that Mahmoud Abbas is just as old as Biden, his time is coming, hopefully. And so, has there been any conversation about incorporating Hamas within the PLO portfolio, considering that a lot of Palestinians who are aware of what the potential of PLO and representing more than just a fragmentation Palestine inside, but rather also the diaspora, which has been reawakened since the Unity Intifada and also in this genocide. So my question is seeing that the PA is on its last limb, what role can Hamas play? And has there been a conversation of incorporating them, considering that there's a large support of their movement for liberation, of their kind of confrontation with Israel as a colonial settler project rather than as somebody you collaborate with for a two-state solution?
Yeah, I mean, there have been non-stop, practically, attempts by Hamas and its allies, and this is not just a binary, this is not just Hamas and Fatah, but Hamas's allies include, obviously, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and also the Popular Front and the Democratic Front. So you've got a broad, ideological array of people who are working with Hamas right now. And it's a very complex situation. How will I describe it best? So one of the key things there was the prisoners document that came out in, was it 2006 or 2008, when the prisoners from all the factions came together and made a joint appeal to the leaders of their factions outside for national unity. And given the fact that prisoners have this kind of important role in all of these movements, you would have hoped that this prisoners document, which was spearheaded by Hamas and by Marwan Barghouti, would have persuaded Mahmoud Abbas, but no. So, Fatah and its tragic history. Mahmoud Abbas and his like tragic history. He basically, he's been on the US payroll for so long that he and his family and his buddies, I don't think he can even imagine a way to exist off the US-Israeli payroll. And he and his buddies have systematically axed all the attempts to bring Hamas into the PLO. And that's just one of the many things he's done to undercut the broader Palestinian liberation movement. Obviously, he's not going to live forever, but if it's amazing what medical technology can do. I mean, just look at King Salman of Saudi Arabia, apparently still alive. So we can't necessarily count on Abu Mazen dying. And if he does, he does have these kind of henchmen who have like this guy, whatever his name is, Mahmoud Mustafa, is it his prime minister? People who are like totally wedded to the US payroll and whatever. So outside actors need to play a greater role, I think, in bringing about this national unification. The Chinese tried, was it in August, when the heads of all the factions went to Beijing? Maybe the Algerians could try, because the Algerians back in the early days of the PLO, when the Fedaiyin movements were thinking of going into and taking over the PLO, which originally was a creation of the Arab states, the Algerians were urging them to unify completely their factions, as Algerians themselves had done in the FLN. And Fatah, for whatever reason, Abu Ammar and the other leaders at that time, who definitely did not include Abu Mazen, who was kind of just a money man for them in Qatar. They didn't do that. But an interesting result is that Fatah itself is a highly decentralized and disparate organization. So actually, in the joint operations room in Gaza right now, you not only have, for the military operations, in as much as they're able to coordinate, you not only have the Qassam brigades from Hamas and the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades from the PFLP, but you also have the Al-Aqsa brigades from Fatah. And if you look at what's happening in northern West Bank, there's a lot of Fatah grassroots militant networks very involved in active resistance alongside Hamas and in coordination with Hamas. So it's a very fuzzy picture. I think nearly all Palestinians, I wouldn't even want to say that, but a lot of Palestinians recognize that the PLO has this like international recognition that is worth something. I don't know. Is international law, the international state system as we now have it, is it doing anything for Palestinians? Not really, but it's all there is. I shouldn't speak for Palestinians. I'm not going to. So yeah, I hope that's started to answer some of your question.
Could I fill in just a number of gaps? That's not a question, but it was Olmert. He was acting PM. It was 105.
Okay, thank you.
2008 for the statement. Mohammed Mustafa.
Damn, we should work together.
And it was 14 factions in the China meeting.
Yeah.
Not just the two.
Yeah. Definitely a lot of factions in China. Great, thank you.
Sorry for.
No. I have kind of a follow-up question on are there attempts to kind of bypass Abbas? Like, are there attempts by members of Fatah, right? Because you just talked about Fatah being decentralized and these groups kind of engaging in armed resistance under the banner of Fatah. But are there attempts, right, to go back to Leigh's question about a unity government, right, or a unity? Are there conversations, and the Hamas has come out and said, we will join a unity government under the leadership of Baghouti. Are there conversations that that you're hearing about that are happening? I mean, obviously, the US is a powerful force in all of this, right? Because they're trying to they do control the PA, right? And they're trying to come up with all these scenarios in which their men will control the future, right? But are there conversations happening that are bypassing this, or, I mean, you gave the example of Beijing, but yeah, is there more going on that we're not hearing about? And I'm not someone that's necessarily following this that closely, that's why, yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot going on that I don't know about, and the person who would know about it, if anybody, is Moin Rabbani.
Yeah.
But I mean, I had a couple of long conversations with him about this back in like maybe December of last year.
Yeah.
And he said, for now, you have to try to bring like the the PA over into a coalition. I don't know what his current view on this is. We had a good discussion of that in the webinar session with him. So, you know, just so that people in general understand this, the PA is, you have to say, it's kind of the love child of the marriage of the PLO and Yitzhak Rabin in 1993. So the PA is not the authoritative body. The PLO could potentially say to the Americans, who are the guarantors of Oslo, and to the Israelis, we are going to withdraw from Oslo. And that would be the end of the PA. It would be the end of American funding to Abu Mazen's cronies, which I guess is why he doesn't want to do it. There's a big history of that in the settler colonial history of this country too, where there's a wonderful book called 13 Moons about, was it the Cherokee or somebody, some big nation down in the South, where, you know, the heads of the Cherokee nation, or the crown princes, if you like, married American women and were given fellowships to Harvard, and then they completely sold out their people. I mean, this is a long tradition in this country.
You've got one question back there and then one up here, yeah.
How are we doing on the Zoom? Do we have questions on the Zoom?
Just one question on Zoom. We'll get to that at the end for some.
Yeah, please.
So earlier you talked about how.
Could you speak up a little?
Sure. So earlier in your talk, you mentioned a little bit about how, the more that, we see the more that the genocide persists, and has the more kind of support that Hamas is getting regionally and globally, and the Palestinian diaspora as well. So I wonder, like, for example, I know like the university student body elections, for example, in the West Bank, like the leaderships are united with like whichever like political party. And I know, like, for example, in recent years, like Hamas has been winning at Judaism. So I just wondered, do you think that there's a possibility to see like Hamas grow a lot more in the West Bank? Is there a chance of sort of like a unified intifada going on in Gaza and the West Bank? It's more theoretical, but just your thoughts.
I think it's already happening to a large degree. If you look at the polling that Khalil Shiqaqi has been doing, I've read his polls. He's been running this series of polls for like, maybe it's number 92, number 93, and he does them every quarter. So somebody do the math. That's about 22 years or whatever that he's been doing these quarterly polling of Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. I'm often a bit skeptical about political polling, but it does show the trends, you can say. And even in the horrible situation of mass displacement in Gaza, he was able to run the poll in Gaza in late May. I'm not sure if he's been able to do one since then, or how one would think of doing, in-person polling. But Hamas and this has happened, like this has been a phenomenon for quite a long time, has more popularity in the West Bank than in Gaza, and that has increased. And many people explain that by saying, well, yeah, because the people in the West Bank have the direct experience of living under the PA. So, that's a powerful reason to vote against them. And probably with the lack of funding for the PA now, that has also dented Fatah's appeal. So one of the problems that I have with Khalil Shikaki's polling is that he has never, so far as I know, attempted to poll Palestinians in the near diaspora, which is a really important constituency, including in Jordan. And one of the most interesting things that happened after Sinwar's death in action was that the Hamas Shura Council came out with a call for Palestinians and their friends everywhere to besiege Zionist embassies. And I would imagine that is going to be aimed in large part at the Zionist embassies in Jordan and maybe Egypt, but also Morocco. And we might see something happening over maybe at the end of Friday prayers this week in Jordan. I don't know. I mean, there have been huge demonstrations in Jordan, but that's all we've seen so far. The West Bank, yeah, the West Bank, of course, is thoroughly ghettoized. I mean, this is such a traditional colonial practice. The French and the British used to call it quadrillage, when you divide everything, and the British really perfected this in Palestine in the 1930s. So the Israelis have now done it again, dividing up the West Bank into these tiny little bite-sized portions. It's going to be a huge challenge for the people of the West Bank to mount anything large and significant, which is why we need a lot of international support for the legitimate rights of the Palestinians there, and as in Gaza.
So we have one question here and then one online.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the US public opinion on the resistance at large. I mean, you did do research on the PLO and the resistance in the 60s and the 70s, and it was labeled as terrorism or terrorist. And now, like 50 years later, October 8th, we kind of saw the same frames, the same discourses, the same stereotypes, the same misunderstanding dominating the media, the political debate. So I was curious to know, I mean, I as someone, I understand why it's important to know Hamas, but I'm also, is it really important, and on what level, if, just the mere fact of resisting a colonial entity, no matter what the group was, no matter what the ideology was, no matter what the action that they took, is going to be automatically shut down as a form of terrorism, then where do we need to put our energies now? And then my second question is, that as a aspiring scholar, but also as a student and as someone that works with students who just started college, there's really no space to understand Hamas or talk about it. The minute you start talking about Hamas, even if you want to historicize it or contextualize it, there's of course a fear to start this conversation. And then if you start it, then there's always this idea that you're automatically anti-Semitic just for, wanting to understand and wanting to explore. And I'm not sure how we can do that in our classrooms in a way that will protect the students, but will also empower them actually to talk about that. And then my final question is, sorry, I want to take advantage of
taking
you
good notes here.
I'm also wondering, on a political level, how do we start, send this? I mean, do they care? I mean, do they know what Hamas is, and they really don't care because there's a lot of material and political interest between the US and Israel, that even if they know Hamas is a political movement, that, you know, every occupied people had resisted using revolutionary violence, it doesn't matter because, you know, it's Israel and no one can resist Israel in a way at this moment.
Okay, I'll try to take these in order. They're all good questions. So, you know, when I was here in the 1980s with all these wonderful people at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, we were lonely. We were so lonely. The only people in this country who even thought, well, not the only, but nearly the only people in this country who recognized that Palestinians are people and possibly have rights were liberal Republicans. Now, people on the left in this country were like gung-ho for Israel's like assault on Beirut. In 1982, the opposition to the Sabra and Shatila massacres was far stronger in Jewish Israeli society than it was in American society. I mean, in Israeli society, they had like 1 million people on the streets, which given that their population was only 4 million, that was massive, and it brought down the Begin government. Whereas here it was like, you know, maybe there was something wrong, don't know. It's all complicated. So we've had a massive reversal of this between Jewish Israeli society and American society, where now Jewish Israeli society has lurched repeatedly to the right, and American society has moved noticeably, although not yet sufficiently, to the left or to the pro-Palestinian side. I mean, honestly, back then in 82, I mean, it was very traumatic for me because I had just left Beirut, and all my like friends and my ex-husband from whom I was separating, but that was another issue. But you know, all my friends were in Beirut getting the shit bombed out of them, and there was Jane Fonda, icon of the anti-war left in this country, who went to support the Israeli troops. I mean, that's how bad it was. So, you know, the left was all pro-Israel, is what I want to say, back in 1982. Now it's very different. And, you know, now, thank God, we have, you know, wonderful Arab American scholars. Arab Americans are a much bigger like factor in American society, much more visible factor. And amongst them, obviously, thousands of fine Palestinian American scholars and business people and thinkers and teachers. So, you know, the Arab American vote in Michigan, for example, in this election, it's a real thing. It's a very real thing. You didn't have anything like that back in 1982. So I see like that things are, from that point of view, better in American society, but not at the kind of the top decision-making level where money speaks and received wisdom from, you know, decades of Zionist indoctrination speaks very loud. So one of the nice, amazing new things that's happened has been this young generation of Jewish activists in this country. When I was doing book events 10 days ago in the Bay Area, we reached out to a lot of local pro-Palestinian organizations. And it's not a like, I don't think I'm telling any secrets when I say that a lot of those organizations were very wary of hosting or co-sponsoring book events for us because of the name of the book. and especially mosques, of which there are a lot in the South Bay, and many of the Palestinian grassroots organizations there, because they don't want to touch the H word. So the people who ended up sponsoring my book events were two wonderful large chapters of Jewish Voice for Peace, and a couple of churches and some community organizations based amongst, in like the Latino and African American communities, where they really get this whole idea of national liberation. So I think, being accused of being anti-Semitic because we want to talk about Hamas, no, it is not anti-Semitic to talk about Hamas. And we can really show that in many different ways. And I think it's great that JVP and these two Presbyterian churches and these other community organizations in the Bay, it's like a long campaign to crank up the Overton window. If you know what an Overton window is, it's like the space in which you can have a discussion. And it's obviously not happening nearly fast enough, but it has definitely been happening. And then the question about the political class in this country, do they care? Yeah, no, I don't think they care about anything apart from money, really. But there has been change. I was at a dinner party last night when some of our friends were saying, yes, but the New York Times and the Washington Post are far more open to Palestinian voices and Palestinian points of view than they ever have been before. I'm not so sure about that, but I think it's true, that they are, there's tumult in these newsrooms, where their job basically is to manufacture consent for the military industrial complex in this country. And the thinking people in the newsrooms are saying, we're seeing this genocide, we have to report it accurately. And I think it's very healthy that there is tumult in the newsrooms. So it's not fast enough, but it's happening. I don't know, obviously people are very concerned about what's going to happen with the elections here. But at the broader level, I mean, I also, because I work on this level of globalities, like looking at the global balance of power, all of this tumult and excessive reliance on military means and diplomasoclasm. That wonderful word that I coined just yesterday. It's all a sign of a fading US hegemonic power. So that's great. We've got to have international allies and try to get what we can, both through working in this country and through international alliances.
Thank you. So we have one more question and then we're going to give you some rest, right? So there's been a lot of criticism of, I'm reading, of Israel for lacking a plan for the so-called day after. Especially the countries in the GCC have been assigned or are willing to assume an active role in a scenario, but they on the condition of excluding the PA and Hamas. How will that affect Hamas and its structures if the wealthy regional players will use their influence and financial support to keep Hamas out of Gaza? Would it be possible for them to push Hamas out of Gaza?
No. First of all, there are always people like Ronen Bergman, who writes in the New York Times and then writes something completely different in Yediot Aharonot. Mm-hmm. And there are, a lot of well-connected sort of intelligence-y type people who say, oh, the GCC countries are just about to come on board. They're not. Mm. I mean, where is Mohammed bin Salman this week? Where's Mohammed bin Zayed this week? they're in Kazan, Russia, at the BRICS meeting. They are not, banging at the door of Washington to come and solve any problems for them in the Gulf or in the region, in West Asia more generally. So I think there's a lot of things going on internationally in West Asia in which China and Russia and the rest of the BRICS are all involved, which pose a kind of a counter to the hegemony that the US has exercised there since the 1970s, since the end of the British trucial states in 1970. So yeah, the world is changing very fast. It's not changing fast enough to save the people of Gaza from being shredded and humiliated and run over with bulldozers and the most ghastly things happening to their people in detention. But all of that, all of the actions that Israel is taking in Gaza with full US support is hastening the shift in the international balance.
All right. Thank you very much, Lana.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to come back after